Well, thank you for all turning up on this freezing afternoon. This was apparently the boiler house, which is why they didn't put any insulation in it, because it would have had an enormous boiler, designed for getting rid of heat. So there are multiple roles that we play in our lives, and one of my roles is that I'm Hindu clergy. I'm a member of an old yogic order called the Nath Sampradaya. And in that domain, my name is Narakanath, which basically means Lord of Hell, which is kind of appropriate if you spent half of your career dealing with nuclear terrorism, pandemic, flu, failed states, and so on. I did a lot of time dealing with the end of the world. My business card used to say I don't get out of bed for less than 1% mortality, and it was true. If it was going to kill less than 1% of the ambient population, there was no point getting me involved. And I worked mainly as a strategic planner. So as we watch the current flu pandemic come up around us, bear in mind you're going to spend most of the rest of the summer staying indoors and staying away from people, because if you go outside, they might give you disease that has about a 1 in 200 chance of killing you, and way more if you're old. Right? We really are going to have a very, very complicated, difficult year. China has, hundreds of millions of people in quarantine right now just to keep them away from each other to slow up the rate at which the flu is spreading. Now, here's the question. Did I just tell you the truth, or did I just tell you a myth? Kind of both, right? It's quite hard to say right now on available data for sure how bad that flu pandemic will be. Right? The critical number is a thing called the CFR, the case fatality rate. Of the number of people that get the flu, how many of them die? And what makes that hard to tell is we don't know how many mild cases there are. So everybody agrees that's looked at the flu, about 50% of humans will catch the flu. It's incredibly infectious. And we've got really good evidence to show it's incredibly infectious. The infectiousness is not in doubt. What we don't know is, of the people that have died, how many people got infected for every person that died, because the people that get mild cases think they've got the cold, and the people that have severe cases wind up in hospital. So how do we know at this point in the game which way it's going to go? The answer is we don't. Right? Some scenarios, it overwhelms the health service and a whole bunch of people die needlessly at home because there were no hospital beds. In the other direction, the whole thing largely blows over because it turns out everybody gets it, and it's basically a common cold, apart from one old person in 50 that gets really ill and then the health service saves them. We really don't know which way this goes. But if we wait until we've got solid data, it's too late for us to do anything. So you have to start the machinery before you know the truth, and the assumptions you make, the stories that you tell, that enable you to act before you have all the facts, are the myths which are inevitably folded up inside of all of our activities. In any situation where you deal with the unknown and where you have to make decisions before you have all the data, you wind up telling yourself a story about what will happen, and that story is a kind of projective myth. And those projective myths, they're not there because we're dreamers or because we're unrealistic. They're there because if you wait until you have all the facts, it's too late to act. Now, does that remind us of any other situations where we might have a need to take stiff action but be unable to do it because we don't have the right mythological structure to get us moving? Right? So the obvious one is climate change. Right? We don't have all of the data. We've sure got a lot of data. We've got way more data than we did 20 years ago. But the smart money started panicking 25, 30, 40 years ago. Right? I remember meeting Albert Bates of the World Watch Institute in 1995, and he told me exactly where we were going. Here we are, 25 years in the future from that point. He nailed it exactly. He knew exactly what was going to happen. So because we lack the myths to cause us to take action before all the facts are in play, we're going to get hit way harder by climate change than we would have gotten hit if we had had the correct mythic structure that corresponded to getting us to act in the ways that were necessary for our own survival. Does this make sense as a model? Right. Now, you think, but what are the other examples where that's hit us? Like, is this really that big a problem? Is anybody old enough to remember the AIDS epidemic, where suddenly pretty much all the gay people you knew died? Right? So the problem is that there was an insufficient basis for panic. Right? if they'd done panic, if they'd done contact tracing, if they'd done all the normal things that you do when you have an epidemic, in all probability, they could have hugely slowed up the number of people that would have gotten AIDS in the early years, and far more of those people would have lived long enough to get protease inhibitors because they would have gotten infected after the medicine had a chance to catch up. But because of the mythic structures that emerged around AIDS, where nothing could be done, gay cancer, GRID, it was widely understood as not being a thing that could be addressed. So all the logical, sensible stuff that could have been done wasn't done, and the death toll was enormously larger than it had to be. Right? So again and again and again and again, we get into situations where we're confronted by data. The data suggests a threat but isn't fully compelling. And in the instances where we've got the right myths in our heads, we react and often overreact. Can we think of a threat that we're overreacting because we've got the right myths for overreaction? Say terrorism is a good one, right? Terrorism? Say again? Immigration. Immigration's another good one, right? Although immigration, there's a bunch of really horrible suppressed data about immigrant behavior in Scandinavia, right? Because the Scandinavian myth is immigration should be fine, and the reality is it turns out that moving people across cultures is super hard. So hard to say which way that one goes, because in that instance, we've got multiple myths simultaneously, a bunch of bad right-wing myths and a bunch of evidence suppression on the left. Kind of hard to say where the truth is because the truth has become politicized. And the politicization of truth is a problem for another talk. Right now, I'm really just talking about how we deal with the unknowns rather than why some people keep the unknowns as unknowns when we could know. That's a different problem. So if we take the terrorism instance, nobody you know is going to die of terrorism. It's almost as rare as getting hit by falling space junk. But because we had a mythic structure that could readily absorb that threat as a threat, people very, very, very quickly mobilized down around terrorism as a thing that they were worried about, and you saw an enormous overreaction around terrorism because we had the myths where we took a little bit of data, we massively extrapolated that into a story, and then the myth caused us to take action. So the thing that I want to highlight here is that we think of myths as being about things which aren't real. Right? Oh, the myth of the green man. Well, real, unreal, depends what kind of real you mean, but certainly not something that you're likely to run a car into on a country road at night. Right? And those kind of myths are all well and good, but the myths that actually govern our behavior are the myths where we look into the future on available data and guess what will happen. Projections, futurism, scenario planning, anticipatory response, design science. All of these are situations where we take a little bit of data and we just fill in the gaps with these mythic structures. And if you map out those mythic structures in the areas where we have stories about reality, which are not based on very much data, they're based on press, media, older stories, previous generations' experience, the kind of boiling down of things that happened over and over again into patterns, all of that stuff constitutes the vast majority of what happens in our society when we're confronted with a new situation. Everybody runs for their myths because the thing that makes a new situation new is that you don't really know which way it's going to go. In my own life, I've watched 3 generations of the crypto revolution where computer scientists suddenly got a new round of tools to play with in cryptography, and in every one of those rounds, the myth that they tell is libertarian anarchism will take over the world, and everybody will be freed from the shackles of the state. And every single time, what happens is that those cryptographers rapidly turn into bankers. And then at that point, they might as well be the state because they've picked up all of the trammels of capitalism in the process, because it just turns out that money has its own logic. And you start with a bunch of anarchist rebels who have no money, who suddenly have some money. And pretty soon what you discover is that, 4 legs are good, but 2 legs are better. And we've seen that cycle time after time after time. Orwell's Animal Farm turns out to be enormously predictive of revolution because it turns out that running things turns you into the kind of person that runs things. Right? Or the kind of people that run things happen to be latent with nothing to run inside of your anarchist population, and as the anarchists get a chance to run some stuff, pretty soon the anarchists that are most like that wind up the ones in charge. Because being in charge of anarchy is always a falling. So These kind of patterns, does everybody see how this stuff is kind of unavoidable, right? It's baked into the structure of time that you will have to make decisions before you have all available data. As a result, you have to make assumptions, and the way that we store and catalog those assumptions is in cultural stories about the future, which are the fabric of our mythic reality. Now, there are two ways that things cross from this mythic fabric into the actuality of life. One of them is, like with the pandemic flu, people just keep getting flu, right? And governments either keep them away from each other and make adaptation or don't. Individuals either make adaptation or don't. But one way or the other, what settles the situation of what is happening with the flu is a bunch more people get flu, and then eventually the thing peters out, and you see how many people died. And that's pretty much the entire cycle. But this is not the only situation, because that's a situation where the thing goes from being a myth to being a reality, generally speaking, without human intervention. Events take their course. Some governments will keep people safer and keep them away from each other because they mythically assume bad. Other governments will largely ignore it because they mythically assume good. But in both cases, history will make up its own mind. It's a whole different kettle of fish when we start talking about technology. So if I look at computers in, say, 1984, I can say, that's a pretty good replacement for a spreadsheet, and I can see how you'd use it for typing letters on, and you could play some games. That's amazing. I think there's a global market for maybe 2 million computers, right? Or you could look at it and say, 10 years ago, that thing cost 50 times what it does today, and in the future, these things are going to be so cheap, you could use them to replace practically every appliance in the home. That's amazing. Wow, this is the most important thing I've ever seen. Right? So when we're confronted with new technology, some people have a mythic structure that causes them to engage. Other people have a mythic structure that causes them to ignore. And because technology has been coming on so fast, so hard, and so successfully for the past 50 or so years, the people whose mythic structure enables them to rapidly absorb technology and make optimistic forecasts about what it will achieve, or at least how much of it will be available, those people have tended to prosper. And the people that have that mythic structure are, of course, nerds. Right? Now, the nerd thing, it's kind of ill-defined because non-nerds don't really understand what makes nerds tick. Right? There's a lot of ambiguity about what is the nerd. And the nerd is basically a combination of two forces. The first force is autism. Right? I'm absolutely serious. An enormous amount of the kind of alpha nerd class, the people that really get things done in nerddom, are somewhere on the autism spectrum, usually on the strong side of Asperger's. And there's a lot of this. I've spent an awful lot of time working for companies run by alpha nerds who are well out on the spectrum, and my autist wrangling skills are excellent because that's essentially what I've done for a living a good chunk of the time. And you've got a few sociopaths mixed in as well to kind of help the nerds get things done. But for the most part, autism is the dominant cultural style of technology. The other force is the great unnamed religion of the era. Right? Can anybody name the state religion of the nerds? Does anybody know what it is that unites all of the nerds in a fundamental, monolithic cultural block? Google? Not Google. Come on, anybody can pick it up? World Wide Web? No. One more try? Star Wars, close, but no cigar. Sorry. Because Star Wars is about magic and swords, and nerds are really poorly coordinated, and they don't believe in magic. Right? No, the great unifying force is, of course, Star Trek. Right? And by the way, right now my first customer is William Shatner, so I have to make a kind of disclaimer here. I am actually Shatner's blockchain dude, so I have quite a lot of exposure to this thing right now. Typically when I go to conferences, I'm carrying around a clear plastic briefcase filled with Star Trek toys that Shatner has signed, and I'm talking about the blockchain and provenance and all the rest of that stuff. The company is called Materium, and you will never see a nerdier project. We designed it very carefully. It is the apex of nerdery. So Star Trek is the state religion of the geeks. And I literally say state religion Because the vast majority of the actual content in Star Trek is moral philosophy, and specifically, it is kind of high liberalism, right? If you think about Kirk, Kirk basically constantly tries to avoid screwing up at a moral level. They're always trying to do the right thing. They always get into complicated moral situations, and to get out of the complicated moral situation, they usually have to do something absurd like kill a god, or fix an entire culture by showing them the truth about where their religion originated. But in every instance, there's a rational explanation for what happens. The lead characters are struggling for a moral solution. They hardly ever use violence to solve their problems, and when they do use violence, it's always what's the word I'm looking for? Unsatisfactory. They never get into a position where the answer is just to kill the bad guy and then everything is fixed. They might wind up killing the bad guy, but they always have to deal with the problem the bad guy caused as a separate process. And there were a set of rules for this. Roddenberry had a manual that he forced the Star Trek writers to adhere to, and that manual was a manual about the morality of an evolved human species, and they tried to pump the morality of an evolved human species backward into the nerds. Right? This is a really impressive piece of cultural engineering, right? I mean, like, a lot of work went into that. And, there are all kinds of weird stories about the Roddenberrys being involved in, like, talking to spirits from other dimensions that would basically give them all these stories that they then write down. The whole thing gets weirder the longer you look at it, and I have no idea what's true and what's not true from those stories. Now, would everybody like to get really uncomfortable? Yeah. So, we take this Star Trek thing, and the nerds grow up as children watching the Star Trek thing, and then they get to the productive part of their lives where they have the ability to change the world by building new technology. Right? So what happens is that the nerds gradually start to drag human society in the direction of Star Trek, whether you like it or not. Right? Now, how far have they gotten down this process? Does everybody have a communicator? Right? 100% market penetration for the Star Trek communicator. 100%. This thing is the most powerful force in your society, and I guarantee you, if Star Trek hadn't been there, it would have been held up another 20 years, maybe longer. Right? So every time you pick this up, you're picking up Star Trek. Every time you touch this, you are touching the state religion of the nerds, because this is our first miracle. Right? And if you want to reject the religion of Star Trek, you have to stop using cell phones. Right? Is anybody willing to make that sacrifice to have their own religion? Great, so you're all with us. No, you haven't got one. Okay, one heretic. Quick, fetch the wood pile. Right? Oh wait, that's Catholicism, not Star Trek. In Star Trek, you just ignore those people. Right? So, this is no joke, because what's happening is that there is an enormous transformation of human culture by technology, and that technology is exclusively steered by science fiction. Whatever it is the nerds are reading is what you're going to get. Right? In the 1980s and 1990s, there was a brief fashion for a science fiction subgenre called cyberpunk, which was basically where noir fiction and a kind of dystopian futurism intersected with cybernetics and computers. And it was all about surveillance societies and enormously powerful corporations and a screwed up environment and dystopian use of robots and artificial intelligence and all the rest of that. And that stuff was super fashionable from about 85 to probably 9/11, right? Which is basically a 15-year, 20-year wedge. And all of the nerds of my age group read that stuff, watched that stuff, got exposed to that stuff, and now they run Google, Amazon, Facebook, and everything else, right? And all of those dystopian ideas about corporate power and the interface between state and market and all the rest of that stuff that were baked into cyberpunk, because that stuff got read a lot, these people went out and built it. Now, what I'm not suggesting is that we need state regulation of science fiction in the Soviet model. Right? I mean, that's literally how the Soviets tried to steer their society. They tried to steer what myths you were allowed to talk about and think about in a way that allowed them to control the imaginations of entire generations. This is not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, how many of you regularly read science fiction? Okay, right? Now, that's happening because of class war, right? You know, Jules Verne and the Brontes are writing at about roughly the same time, right? There's an enormous upsurge of science fiction around the early days of the Industrial Revolution, and there is a cultural war in the UK between the landed aristocracy that want to deny cultural legitimacy to science and engineering because they don't control science and engineering, and the science and engineering elites who are largely in the north, who have their own fiction, they have their own authors, they have their own desire to see the future shaped a particular way, and they have tons of money because it turns out that they're incredibly productive. So this whole thing of, you know, William Blake and the dark satanic mills versus this kind of pastoral hogwash, that right there is a way of making sure that the scientists and the engineers don't wind up running society. And so what happens is the delegitimization of the myths of the scientists and the engineers from the literary canon, right? That's why you don't study Star Trek in high school. You live in a world which is completely dominated by a 50-year-old myth, which has shaped the imaginations of 3 generations of scientists and shaped the physical world around you in incredibly deep ways. But if you do a PhD in Star Trek, people laugh at you. They don't just laugh at you, they laugh at your institution. And this is literally because the English landed aristocracy cut a deal with the poets to pretend that sheep were magical. Right? Well, how much have sheep transformed your civilization? Right? The last major impact that sheep had was the Highland clearances where my ancestors got kicked off their land in Ayrshire. Right? So this idea that pastoralism is in some way naturally related to the poetic, right? That is cultural warfare by the English aristocracy on the working class, so that the aristocracy are looked upon as being associated with that which is good and artistic and holy, because that's what William Blake told you, rather than asking questions about going to the moon, which is where Jules Verne was at. Right? And that systematic cultural warfare to deny cultural legitimacy to science fiction is why nobody reads it and why very few people write it, which means that you wind up with a cultural schism in which all of the power to control the future is in the hands of people that nobody has any respect for. And that is class war that happened right here, right? Not that long ago, where the fiction and the art of the engineers and scientists was delegitimized as being high art. But there is no higher art than the art that controls the future of the species, and we are making it, and nobody's reading it. At least we're reading it, and we continue to define the future of the species based on it, while everybody else is going back to read the frickin' Bronte sisters. Right? Frankenstein was the important story, not Wuthering Heights. Frankenstein was the story that informed generations of people working on artificial intelligence and robotics. Wuthering Heights informed who about what? Right? And that cultural gap is why we feel like we have no control of what is happening in society. Because all the people that are making those decisions are living in a different parallel culture, which is the culture of the outcasts. It's the literary culture that dare not speak its name, but it's where all the definitive decisions are being made. Now, did that all broadly make sense? Now here's the question. Is that the truth, or is it just another myth? Right? It's a very convincing story that fills in the gaps and points to a whole bunch of data points, but how do you figure out whether it's real or not? You have to wait and see whether the world continues to look more and more like Star Trek, generation by generation by generation, or whether some other body of mythic material comes in and takes over. You have to figure out whether the Japanese really build giant fighting robots after 40 years of exposure to Power Suit manga, or whether they go off and do something else. You know, when you see the Japanese take to the field in 4-story high killer robots, you will know that this hypothesis is true. Right? How long do you think it's going to be? Right? Now, I think we're now ready to get to the point. Right? Everybody's looking at me like something bad is going to happen. So, Practically everything in human life involves dealing with the unknown, right? And we all have machinery in our brains which causes us to tell stories about the unknown, and then we sort of put weight on those stories as if they're true, because doing something and getting it wrong is still better on average in the long run than doing nothing and waiting for the facts. We're made to take the risky guess, because if we don't take the risky guess, we stay in our cave and we freeze to death, right? So what I want everybody to walk away from this with is a model where they understand that they have a whole operating system inside of their head about how to take the risky guess. Every time you're confronted in a situation where you don't have real information, you look inside of yourself and you pull out a story, you match the story to reality more or less, and then the story gives you some advice about what to do, and you do it, or you do some of it, or you kind of know what you ought to do and you don't do it, depending on your level of confidence in the story, right? Every time we deal with the unknown, and every day we deal with the unknown. So the Dark Mountain Project's perspective on shaping the myths about the future as a way of changing the way that people would act in the long run was spot on, right? And more and more and more of the Dark Mountain material is folding out into reality, and that's turning into a very successful attempt to get people to do something about climate change before it's too damn late. Because Dark Mountain says, look, if you don't do something about climate change, you're going to get a world that looks like the one that we're writing about, and it's not the end of civilization, and it's not the end of life, and it's not the end of the future, but it's by no means Star Trek. And if you want Star Trek, you've got to empower the Star Trek people to build you Star Trek, which means enormous funding for fusion research, and by the way, we want some spaceships, or you have to accept that you're going to get the dreams of another band of wizards making their own stories about the future and telling them to you as if they were inevitable, which is everybody else. Right? The way that we deal with the unknown roots in myth. There are multiple competing myths. The myths that people act on tend to become true. And my suggestion is that if you don't go for the utopian tech future and make sure that we deliver it, you're going to get some variety of dark pastoralism, which is a dream that nobody really wants to live in. Right? It's a question of fundamental allegiance. Are we just going to sit here and take this, or are we going to form ranks behind the people that gave us clean water, cheap electricity, healthcare that works, vaccines, and the internet, and get those people to solve the rest of our problems? There we are. Done.
Okay, we have time for 2 questions. We have 2 questions, so whoever puts their hand up quickest gets it. Nobody. Oh, this guy. Oh, yeah, that helps.
Thank you. So, agreed. There's lots of stories and myths out there. And then you've got politicians like Bernie Sanders who's trying to do the right thing, but there's a vast majority of people that aren't believing in that. How do you shift that narrative?
I don't think that Sanders can solve the problems that confront the human species. He can solve the problems that confront the American middle class, maybe, but I don't see how he's going to solve the rest of the problem. Right? I mean, you know, it's all very well that we tell stories to change things, but is Sanders really going to deliver us a highly functional society with no scarcity right over the entire world by punching through all the technological barriers we need to punch through to get to that world? Or is he going to rearrange how Americans pay for their healthcare, and the band will continue to play on at 8 worlds worth of consumption?
I mean, he's moving more towards a Star Trek vision than anybody else in politics.
Then I'll take it, but you know, like, I would rather, frankly, have had Beto O'Rourke, who was once known as a psychedelic warlord and was one of the early actors in a great hacker underground scene called the Cult of the Dead Cow. Right? President Psychedelic Warlord, that's my guy. And give Beto O'Rourke another, 8 years to polish his political game, and we will get President Psychedelic Warlord, because he'll figure out how to cut the deal with Silicon Valley, and we'll finally have a Silicon Valley president of the world. Okay, next question.
Next question over here. Amit.
So that was so absolutely interesting. And I love the techno future, but what about our connection to nature, our separation from nature, all of what Matt and many others have spoken about?
So the horrible truth here is that the only nature that has any realistic chance of surviving into the future are national parks. Right? At the end of the day, if we don't fence off nature and keep the monkeys out of it, the monkeys will wreck it, right? And you know, the national parks are more or less the only exposure that most of us have to nature, because more or less anywhere you go on the earth which is vaguely human habitable, if this stuff isn't fenced off as parkland, it'll just be villages every 5 or 10 or 15 miles until the entire landscape is filled up and all the trees are chopped down. So I think at this point, it's more realistic to think about nature as being a heritage asset that we protect, so that we have to consciously take responsibility for guarding nature against ourselves, than thinking of nature as being a default baseline assumption that we kind of have and we have to not interfere with. Because the bottom line is that we've turned something like 95% of the animals by weight. So if you weigh everything on Earth that has a spinal column, 95% of that is humans and their pets and their food animals. We've wiped out pretty much all the vertebrates and turned them into pets or food. So in that sense, you know, nature is more or less made of mice at this point. And that's really horrendous, right? I mean, you could go look up the stats on this and it will shake you to the core. We basically took the entire world's animals, killed everything that wasn't a cow, and then had the cows take all the remaining space. And the active guarding of nature against ourselves that the national park mythos embodies, I think is the right way forward. Ideally, you want an Earth which is basically run with more or less the entire planet as a national park, right? You put all of the nasty heavy industry in space where there's no nature to screw up. You take all the genetic engineering and you exile not only the people but the knowledge, right? You just can't get training in advanced biology if you're going to live on planet side. You've got to do that shit on Mars. Because frankly, there's no other realistic way of controlling the risk of genetic engineering. You just cannot have genetic engineering know-how on Earth in high densities with any realistic prospect of preventing somebody, you know, who develops schizophrenia and has access to a lab doing something insane. Right? We have to push the genetic engineering into space, or we have to stop genetic engineering entirely, or we are screwed. And nobody has a realistic approach to handling this. You read the policy papers coming out of things like National Defense University or RUSI on handling biotech risk, and they're laughable. They're just nonsense. They're not even wrong. So, you know, we have to really think about this stuff as nature as an asset that we're protecting from humans, and then we can take proper care of it. There's a nuance here that I've kind of mangled that I want to go back and try and catch just while I can. So, because we don't understand that we've essentially terraformed the planet once already in the form of agriculture, it's very hard for us to understand that the only nature that is left is the nature that we specifically protected. Everything else is agriculture. You know, the Highlands in Scotland, those vast, you know, treeless, barren mountains that everybody is so enthusiastic about, that's a landscape made by agriculture because we cut down all the trees and replaced them with bloody sheep. Right? So a lot of what we think of as being unspoiled wilderness is just peasant agriculture and the damage done by peasant agriculture. And it's not until we get the cows out of the food economy by either all going vegan or replacing them with fake meat that we're going to be able to get nature back, because that's how we make enough space for the national parks to take up half of each continent, which is about the size of the nature that you need for it to meaningfully do things like stabilize the climate. But you know, it's really helpful to look at the numbers for how much of the mass of mammals is now humans and their pets and their food cows, compared to what it was, say, 5 centuries ago. You know, we've really pretty much eaten everything that was there to eat, and the nature that remains, we basically keep it in cages. Cheerful. Oh,
Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there because we're about 30 minutes behind.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Vinay.
Most welcome.